The distant whistle of the train echoed across the desolate plains as Katherine Porter stood on the wooden platform of Willow Creek Station, her gloved hands clutching the handle of a worn leather trunk. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory stretched before her like an endless canvas of possibility and uncertainty. She had traveled alone from Boston following the death of her parents, armed with nothing but determination and a deed to a small parcel of land her father had purchased years ago. The station master eyed her with undisguised skepticism. "Miss, are you certain someone's meeting you? A woman alone in these parts, no one is meeting me," Katherine replied, lifting her chin. "And I intend to remain alone, thank you." The man's bushy eyebrows shot upward. "Remain alone." "Out here? Madam, with all due respect, these lands ain't kind to solitary women." Katherine had heard similar concerns throughout her journey west, but she had made her decision. At 23, she had rejected 2 marriage proposals back east, unwilling to become someone's ornament. Her father's unexpected inheritance, a small cabin and plot of land near Willow Creek, had presented the perfect escape from societal expectations. "I can manage quite well," she said firmly, surveying the dusty main street of the small town. A general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments composed the entirety of Willow Creek. "Could you direct me to Mr. Hawkins? I understand he's the local attorney who handled my father's affairs." The station master shook his head but pointed toward a whitewashed building with a painted sign. "Down yonder, miss, but mark my words, Wyoming ain't Boston. A woman needs protection out here." Katherine thanked him curtly and began the walk into town, ignoring the curious stares from the locals. She had expected this. A well-dressed woman alone was an oddity in such a frontier town. What she hadn't expected was how the vast emptiness of the landscape would make her feel simultaneously liberated and diminutive. The law office of Jeremiah Hawkins was small but tidy. The elderly lawyer looked up from his paperwork, surprise evident in his weathered face when Katherine introduced herself. "Miss Porter, we received word you were coming, but I hardly expected. That is to say, most heirs simply sell their properties from afar." "I intend to live on my father's land, Mr. Hawkins." The attorney's spectacles slipped down his nose as he stared at her. "Live there, alone? My dear, the property is quite isolated 5 miles from town. There's a small cabin, but it's been vacant for years." "Is the deed valid?" Katherine asked, ignoring his concern. "Well, yes, your father paid in full, taxes are current, but then I see no issue. Could you arrange transportation to my property today?" Hawkins removed his glasses, polishing them nervously. "Miss Porter, perhaps you should consider selling." "I have several clients who would offer a fair price, and you could return east with Mr. Hawkins," Katherine interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "My mind is made up. I have sufficient funds to establish myself and skills to maintain a household. Now about that transportation." An hour later, Katherine found herself in a wagon driven by Hawkins' reluctant clerk, heading out of town toward her new home. The young man made several attempts at conversation, each circling back to the same theme. A woman couldn't possibly survive alone in the Wyoming wilderness. When they finally arrived at the property, Katherine understood some of the concern. The cabin was indeed small and showed signs of neglect: a sagging porch, missing shingles, windows filmed with dust. But surrounding it was a breathtaking vista of rolling prairie, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. A small creek bubbled near the property, explaining why her father had chosen this particular plot. "Miss, this really ain't suitable for a lady," the clerk said, setting her trunk on the porch. "Wolves out here, sometimes hostile Indians passing through, not to mention outlaws." "Thank you for your concern," Katherine replied, already assessing what repairs would be needed. "I'll be fine." The young man shook his head. "Town's gathering tomorrow evening at the church. Might want to come meet some folks. Mrs. Hollister takes in boarders, respectable widows and such." After he departed, Katherine pushed open the cabin door, wincing at the protesting creak of rusty hinges. Inside was a single room with a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame without a mattress. Dust covered everything, and a family of mice had clearly made themselves at home. Rather than feeling disheartened, Katherine felt a surprising surge of excitement. This place belonged to her. No one could dictate her choices here. She rolled up her sleeves and began to clean, working until the setting sun no longer provided enough light. That night, she slept on a bedroll atop the floor, a small oil lamp burning beside her. The unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, the wind's whisper, distant coyote calls, the rustle of grass created a wild symphony unlike anything she'd known in Boston. Instead of fear, she felt a curious peace. The next morning, Katherine rode the horse the clerk had left for her back into Willow Creek. Her practical list included seeds, tools, and household necessities. The general store owner, a portly man named Palmer, watched with undisguised amusement as she selected items. "Planting a garden, are you? Awful late in the season, miss." "I can manage with hardy crops," Katherine replied, selecting packets of turnip and cabbage seeds. A woman browsing nearby snorted. "You're the Boston lady staying at the old Porter place, alone." Her emphasis on the last word carried clear disapproval. "Yes," Katherine answered simply. "Won't last a week," the woman announced to the store at large. "City girls don't understand what it takes out here." Several patrons nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Katherine felt her cheeks warm but continued her shopping with dignity. This was merely the first of many such encounters. Over the next 2 weeks, Katherine worked from sunrise to sunset repairing her cabin. She patched the roof, repaired the porch, dug a small garden, and cleaned every inch of the interior. Each trip to town brought more whispers and predictions of failure. "Foolish girl will freeze come winter, probably scared of her own shadow after dark. Hiding from something, I reckon. No decent woman lives without family or husband." Katherine weathered these comments with outward composure, though each barb stung. The church social had been particularly difficult. The women had examined her like an exotic specimen, offering backhanded compliments about her brave foolishness. The men had alternated between dismissive condescension and inappropriate suggestions. One afternoon, returning from town with supplies, Katherine spotted smoke rising from the chimney of her cabin. She slowed her horse, heart racing. Someone was inside her home. Cautiously, she approached, wishing she'd purchased a firearm despite the shopkeeper's mockery at the suggestion. As she reached the porch, the door swung open, revealing a tall man in dusty trail clothes, a worn Stetson pushed back on his head. "Afternoon, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Hope you don't mind. Saw your place and thought it abandoned till I spotted the fresh repairs." Katherine remained on her horse, maintaining distance. "You're mistaken, sir. This is my home and you're trespassing." The man's eyebrows rose and he glanced from Katherine to the cabin and back again. "Your home, alone?" He seemed genuinely puzzled rather than judgmental. "Yes. Now if you'll kindly leave Nicholas Yates, madam," he interrupted, extending a hand she couldn't possibly reach from horseback. "Was riding north when my horse picked up a stone, stopped to rest him and make coffee." He gestured toward the thin wisp of smoke. "Meant no harm." Katherine studied him warily. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. Unlike most men she'd encountered in Willow Creek, his expression held no mockery, just frank curiosity. "Katherine Porter," she finally offered, though she remained mounted. "I'd appreciate if you'd move along, Mr. Yates. I'm not in the habit of entertaining strange men." A smile touched his lips. "Wouldn't expect you to be, but my horse needs another hour and I've got coffee hot. Seems wasteful to throw it out." He stepped back from the doorway. "I'll wait outside if you'd prefer." Something about his straightforward manner made Katherine reconsider. Since arriving in Wyoming, every interaction had been colored by judgment. This stranger seemed to accept her presence as unremarkable. "You may finish your coffee," she conceded, dismounting. "Then you really must continue your journey." Inside, she found he'd not only made coffee but had stoked the fire properly, something she still struggled with. 2 tin cups sat on the table, and the aroma of strong coffee filled the small space. "Sugar," he offered, reaching into his saddlebag. "Luxury on the trail, but I never could abide bitter coffee." Katherine accepted the cup he offered, still standing while he sat at her table. "You're not from around here." "Just passing through," Nicholas confirmed. Heading to my brother's ranch up Montana way. Been working cattle drives in Texas past few years. A cowboy then, he shrugged. Sometimes, scout, ranch hand, whatever pays. Just finished a job delivering horses to Fort Laramie. They fell into surprisingly easy conversation. Nicholas asked practical questions about her water source and garden rather than questioning her decision to live alone. When he described some trouble with her stove's damper, he offered advice without condescension. Should head out, he said eventually, draining his cup. Thanks for the hospitality, Miss Porter. You're welcome, Mr. Yates. At the door, he paused. Mind some unsolicited advice. From one newcomer to another, Katherine braced herself for the familiar criticism. Those turnips you're planting put some mesh around them. Rabbits are fierce this time of year. He tipped his hat again. Good day to you. Katherine watched from the porch as he checked his horse's hoof, mounted with fluid grace, and rode away. The encounter left her feeling oddly disconnected from her routine, as though the brief conversation had highlighted just how isolated she'd become. 3 days later, Katherine was splitting wood, a task she was still mastering, when a wagon approached her cabin. She recognized Mrs. Hollister, the boarding house owner, accompanied by the pastor's wife and 2 other women from town. Miss Porter, Mrs. Hollister called, her voice syrupy with false concern. We've come to check on your welfare. The women descended on her cabin like a flock of judgmental birds. They examined her repairs with surprise, her pantry with disapproval, and her solitary bed with thinly veiled scandal. You simply cannot remain out here alone, Mrs. Hollister declared. Why, just this morning we heard that Jake Emerson spotted rider tracks near your property. Could be anyone, outlaws, drifters, Indians. Mr. Yates, Katherine explained. A traveler whose horse needed rest. He was perfectly respectful. The women exchanged meaningful glances. You allowed a strange man into your home? The pastor's wife asked, horror evident in her voice. He made coffee, Katherine said, immediately regretting her honesty when the women's expressions transformed from concern to outright shock. This is precisely what we feared, Mrs. Hollister said. A woman alone invites impropriety, whether she intends it or not. You must consider your reputation. My reputation is my own concern, Katherine replied, patience waning. Not in a community, dear. We all bear responsibility for maintaining proper standards. Mrs. Hollister's tone sharpened. Several respectable widowers have already inquired about you. Mr. Palmer, for instance. I have no interest in marriage, Katherine interrupted. The pastor's wife sighed dramatically. Pride comes before a fall, Miss Porter. Winter approaches. You'll find yourself desperate for help when the snows come. After they finally departed, full of dire predictions and unwanted advice, Katherine felt the weight of isolation more keenly than before. Their visit had been intrusive and judgmental, yet it was her only human contact in days. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Not because she couldn't manage alone, she was proving quite capable, but because the solitude she'd thought she wanted now felt like a punishment. The following weeks brought early autumn to Wyoming. Katherine's garden yielded its first harvest, protected from rabbits by the mesh barrier she'd constructed following Nicholas's advice. She canned vegetables, repaired the roof again after a fierce storm, and chopped endless cords of firewood in preparation for winter. Each trip to town became an exercise in endurance. The whispers had evolved from mere judgment to outright betting on when she would admit defeat. Mr. Palmer, the general store owner, had begun holding items she requested, claiming she needed her husband's approval for certain purchases. It was petty harassment, designed to drive her back east or into marriage. On a crisp October morning, Katherine was returning from the creek with water when she spotted a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Her heart gave an unexpected leap of recognition. Nicholas Yates guided his horse toward her cabin, looking much as he had before, though perhaps more rested. He raised his hand in greeting. Miss Porter, he called. Still standing your ground, I see. Katherine set down her water buckets. Mr. Yates, I thought you were bound for Montana. He dismounted, leading his horse the final distance. I made it there too. My brother's got a small spread about 3 days' ride north. Then what brings you back this way? Nicholas removed his hat, running a hand through hair that seemed lighter than she remembered, sun bleached to the color of wheat. Truthfully, been thinking about this valley. Land's good here. Water's reliable. Katherine felt a flicker of disappointment. Of course he was probably scouting property. Everyone wanted something in this territory. The southeast section near the foothills is unclaimed, she offered politely. Mr. Hawkins in town handles land matters. Nicholas nodded, but his eyes remained on her face. Your garden saw it coming in. Those turnips protected from rabbits. The fact that he remembered such a small detail from their conversation touched her unexpectedly. Yes, thank you for the advice. Would you care for coffee? I've just put water on to boil. Over coffee, Nicholas explained that he'd been helping his brother establish his ranch, but had decided against staying permanently. Montana winters are harsher than Wyoming's, and my brother's wife is expecting their third child, small cabins already crowded. So you're considering settling here? Katherine asked, thinking on it. He studied her over the rim of his cup. How are the good people of Willow Creek treating their independent lady homesteader? Katherine hesitated, unused to discussing her difficulties. There, adjusting to the idea. Nicholas's smile held no humor. That badly, huh? His perception startled a laugh from her. Is it that obvious? Small towns can be the loneliest places on earth if you don't fit their notion of proper, he said quietly. Judging by how the storekeeper watched me asking after you, I'd say Willow Creek's got strong notions. You asked about me, wanted to know if the lady with the turnip garden was still making a go of it. Nicholas set down his cup. Fellow seemed mighty interested in why I was asking. Suggested you were in need of a husband before winter. Katherine's cheeks warmed with embarrassment and anger. Mr. Palmer has appointed himself my guardian, it seems. He refuses to sell me certain supplies without male approval. Nicholas frowned. What supplies? A rifle, primarily. And ammunition, winter preserves. Even denied me nails last week, claiming they weren't ladies' goods. That's not right, Nicholas said simply. A person needs proper tools out here, regardless of whether they wear trousers or skirts. His straightforward support, without questioning her capabilities, made something tight in Katherine's chest loosen. For months, she'd been defending her choices to everyone, including herself. Nicholas's matter-of-fact acceptance felt like rain after drought. Would you allow me to assist you with those purchases? He asked. Not because you need a man's help, but because Palmer's being deliberately obstructive. Katherine considered his offer. Why would you do that? Because I admire grit, he answered honestly. And because nobody should be denied the means to protect themselves or their property based on foolish prejudice. The next morning, they rode into Willow Creek together. Katherine was acutely aware of the stairs as they made their way to the general store. Nicholas maintained a respectful distance, but their joint appearance was enough to set tongues wagging. Mr. Palmer's expression when they entered was a study in calculation. His eyes darted between them, obviously trying to determine their relationship. Miss Porter, he greeted with exaggerated politeness. And Mr. Yates, Nicholas supplied, his voice pleasant but firm. I understand you've been refusing to sell certain necessary items to Miss Porter. Palmer puffed up defensively. Some things ain't suitable for ladies to handle alone. Is that so? Nicholas's tone remained conversational, but something in his stance made Palmer shift uncomfortably. Where I come from, a storekeeper's job is to sell goods, not decide who's worthy of buying them. Now see here, Miss Porter requires a Winchester rifle, ammunition, preserving supplies, and whatever else she's requested that you've denied her, Nicholas continued smoothly. I'd appreciate if you'd fill that order promptly. Palmer glanced between them again, his expression sour. Didn't realize Miss Porter had found herself a protector. Katherine opened her mouth to object to this characterization, but Nicholas spoke first. Miss Porter doesn't need protection, he said firmly. She needs a fair-minded merchant. If you're not interested in her business, we can certainly ride to the next town. The threat of lost business proved effective. Palmer grudgingly gathered the items Katherine had repeatedly requested. As they were leaving, rifles and supplies in hand, Mrs. Hollister and her circle of friends watched from across the street. their expressions a mixture of shock and vindication. "You realize you've just confirmed their worst suspicions about me," Katherine said as they loaded the purchases into her wagon. Nicholas looked genuinely confused. "Which are? That I'm either so desperate or improper that I'd take up with the first man who showed interest." He considered this, then shook his head. "Folks like that will find fault regardless. If you lived like a nun, they'd call you prideful. If you married the richest man in town, they'd claim you were mercenary. You seem to understand their ways well for a drifter." "Spent my life in small towns before taking to the trail," he explained. "Left home at 18 when my father decided my future for me without consultation. Been making my own way since." As they prepared to part ways outside town, Katherine found herself reluctant to end their interaction. Nicholas had been the first person since her arrival who treated her as an equal, capable human being rather than a curiosity or a problem to be solved. "Thank you for your help today," she said formally, extending her hand. Nicholas took it, his calloused palm warm against hers. "My pleasure, Miss Porter." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be staying in the area a while looking at land. Would it be an imposition if I called on you again, purely as a neighbor?" Katherine should have refused. Every social convention she'd been raised with demanded she protect her reputation by limiting contact with an unmarried man. Yet the prospect of Nicholas's company, intelligent conversation without condescension, was too appealing to reject. "You would be welcome, Mr. Yates." His visits became a bright spot in Katherine's increasingly difficult existence. As October yielded to November, the prairie winds grew bitter, and her cabin, despite her improvements, revealed new weaknesses against Wyoming's harsh climate. Nicholas called every few days, always announcing his presence from a distance and never arriving at inappropriate hours. He brought small gifts: coffee, a book of poetry he'd found in town, once a jar of honey from a settler he'd met. More valuable than these tokens was his practical assistance. He showed Katherine how to properly seal her windows against drafts, helped reinforce her root cellar, and patiently taught her to shoot the Winchester rifle. During these visits, they talked freely. Katherine learned that Nicholas had been raised in Pennsylvania, son of a prosperous merchant who had expected him to join the family business. Instead, he'd headed west, working a succession of jobs from Missouri to Texas. He spoke of cattle drives and mining camps, of mountains and deserts, painting pictures of a country vast beyond imagining. In turn, Katherine shared stories of her sheltered Boston upbringing and her parents' expectations that she would make an advantageous marriage. She described her father's disappointment when she rejected a banker's son and her mother's bewilderment at her desire for independence. "They loved me," she explained one evening as they sat by her fire, "but couldn't understand why their vision of happiness didn't satisfy me." Nicholas nodded. "My father was the same. Couldn't fathom why running a dry goods store seemed like a prison sentence to me." "Do you ever regret leaving?" Katherine asked. He considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the certainty. Knowing where my next meal was coming from, sleeping in the same bed each night." His eyes met hers. "But I'd have regretted staying more. Living someone else's dream hollows a person out." The understanding between them deepened with each conversation. Katherine found herself watching the trail for his approach, her heart quickening at the sight of his horse cresting the hill. When several days passed without a visit, she worried, then chided herself for the concern. Nicholas was free to come and go as he pleased. They had no formal attachment. Meanwhile, Willow Creek's attitude toward her shifted from dismissive judgment to active hostility. The story of Nicholas accompanying her to the general store had morphed into scandalous rumors. Women crossed the street to avoid her, men made crude comments just within earshot, and the pastor had stopped her after church to discuss her immortal soul. The first heavy snow fell in late November, trapping Katherine in her cabin for 3 days. When she finally made it to town for supplies, the reception was frostier than the weather. "Heard your cowboy friend bought the old McDermott place," Mrs. Hollister said, cornering Katherine in the general store. "Mighty convenient, him settling so close to a woman alone." Her emphasis left no doubt about her implication. "Mr. Yates is a neighbor and friend," Katherine replied evenly. His land purchases are his own business. Friend, Mrs. Hollister arched an eyebrow. Is that what they're calling it these days? Because Elmer Jenkins saw his horse outside your cabin past sundown last Tuesday. Katherine felt heat rise to her face. Nicholas had indeed stayed later than usual that evening, helping her repair a leaking roof after a sudden snowmelt. They had worked until darkness fell, then shared a simple meal. Nothing improper had occurred, yet described through Mrs. Hollister's insinuating lens, the innocent evening sounded scandalous. Mr. Yates has been kind enough to assist with certain repairs, she said stiffly. As any good neighbor might. Of course, dear, Mrs. Hollister patted her arm condescendingly. We all understand the difficulties of managing alone, though some find your particular solution rather brazen. Katherine completed her shopping and left town seething with indignation. The unfairness of it all struck her anew that a simple friendship between adults could be so thoroughly distorted by malicious minds. When she reached her cabin, she was surprised to find Nicholas waiting, his horse stamping restlessly in the cold. His expression was troubled. I've heard the talk in town, he said without preamble as she dismounted. It's not right what they're saying about you. Katherine busied herself with unloading her purchases. People will gossip. I knew that when I chose to live alone. This is different, Nicholas insisted. They're deliberately trying to ruin your reputation. My reputation is hardly pristine to begin with, she replied bitterly. A woman living alone is already considered scandalous. Our friendship merely confirms their worst assumptions. Nicholas stepped closer, his expression earnest. Katherine, it was the first time he'd used her given name. I don't want to be the cause of more difficulty for you. She looked up at him, suddenly afraid of what he might say next. What are you suggesting? Perhaps I should keep my distance for a while, let the gossip die down. The proposal made perfect sense, yet the thought of losing Nicholas's company sent a spike of panic through her. Over the past weeks, his visits had become essential to her well-being, not because she needed his help, but because his presence filled a loneliness she hadn't fully acknowledged. Is that what you want? She asked quietly. Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as signaling internal conflict. What I want doesn't matter. I'm concerned about you. It matters to me, Katherine said, surprising herself with her boldness. Your friendship has been important. Something shifted in his expression. It's been important to me too, more than I expected when I stopped here that first day. They stood in silence, the unspoken weight of feeling between them almost tangible. Finally, Nicholas spoke again. There's another option, of course, Katherine's heart quickened. Which is, we could give them something real to talk about. A smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained serious. Katherine Porter, would you consider allowing me to court you properly? The question shouldn't have surprised her, yet it did. They had been circling this possibility for weeks, each conversation drawing them closer, each shared confidence building a foundation stronger than mere attraction. I came west to avoid precisely this, she said softly. Marriage, conventional expectations, surrendering my independence. I'm not offering conventional anything, Nicholas replied. I don't want to own you or change you. I admire your independence. It's what drew me to you from the start. Then what are you offering? Partnership, he said simply. Two independent people choosing to face life together rather than apart. Your cabin or mine, or we build something new. I don't care about the details as long as you're part of them. Katherine studied his face, the honest blue eyes, the lines etched by sun and wind, the earnestness of his expression. In Boston, suitors had promised security, status, protection. Nicholas was offering something she valued far more, respect. I would consider it, she finally said. But I need time. This isn't a decision to make hastily. His smile broadened. I've got nothing but time, Katherine, and anywhere you are is where I want to be. The following weeks brought the full force of Wyoming winter. Snow blanketed the prairie, transforming Katherine's property into a glistening white expanse. Travel became difficult, but Nicholas still made the journey to her cabin every few days, sometimes breaking trail through fresh snowfall to reach her. Their courtship progressed with a refreshing lack of pretense. They discussed practical matters, how they would manage their separate properties, their shared vision of a future that preserved both their independences while building something together. Nicholas never pressed for commitments or made demands. Instead, he demonstrated his intentions through consistent presence and unwavering support. On Christmas Eve, he arrived with a small fir tree strapped to his saddle and a package wrapped in brown paper. Katherine had prepared a special dinner, using precious preserves and the last of her fresh vegetables from the root cellar. They decorated the tree with strings of dried berries and paper ornaments Katherine had crafted, then exchanged gifts by firelight. Nicholas had carved her a set of wooden combs for her hair, the craftsmanship exquisite and delicate. Katherine had knitted him a scarf from wool she'd traded for in town. As a comfortable silence settled between them, Katherine realized she had made her decision weeks ago, but had been afraid to acknowledge it. The independence she had so fiercely protected now seemed hollow without someone to share it with, not just anyone, but this man who saw her strength as an asset rather than a flaw. "Nicholas," she said softly, "I've been thinking about your offer." He looked up from the fire, his expression careful. "And I believe a partnership, as you described it, would be agreeable to me." A slow smile spread across his face. "Agreeable?" Katherine laughed, the sound echoing in the small cabin. "Very agreeable. In fact, I find I cannot imagine my future without you in it." Nicholas moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "Katherine Porter, are you accepting my proposal of courtship, or are you proposing something more definitive?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps courtship is unnecessary when two people already know their minds." She met his gaze steadily. "I would be honored to build a life with you, Nicholas Yates, as your wife and partner." His kiss was gentle, a question and answer all at once. When they parted, his eyes shone with emotion. "You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming Territory, even though I insist on maintaining my own property and opinions," she teased. "Especially because of that," he replied seriously. "I never wanted a woman who would disappear into my shadow. I want someone who stands beside me, challenging me when I'm wrong and supporting me when I'm right." The blizzard that began that night kept Nicholas at Katherine's cabin for 3 days. When they finally made it to town together, they went directly to the pastor's house to arrange their marriage. The man's surprise at their announcement was evident, but he agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. Some reactions were predictably smug, Mrs. Hollister declaring she knew all along that Katherine's independence was merely a ploy to attract a husband. Others were genuinely congratulatory, particularly those who had come to respect Katherine's determination, despite their initial skepticism. The wedding was small but meaningful. Katherine wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the amber highlights in her brown eyes. Nicholas had purchased a new shirt and had his suit pressed by the hotel proprietor's wife. They exchanged simple vows and rings Nicholas had ordered from a jeweler in Cheyenne. After the ceremony, several townspeople approached them with unexpected warmth. Mr. Palmer, perhaps feeling remorseful about his earlier behavior, presented them with a fine set of china. The blacksmith and his wife invited them for Sunday dinner. Even Mrs. Hollister managed sincere-sounding congratulations. As they rode away from town, heading toward Nicholas's property where they had decided to make their home together, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "They're already revising history," she said with a laugh. "Mrs. Hollister told me she always knew I'd make a fine wife once I got over my stubborn streak." Nicholas shook his head. "Small towns have short memories when it suits them. By next year they'll claim they welcomed you with open arms from the start. Does it bother you?" "The gossip, the judgment. Not anymore," he replied. "Though I admit it troubled me to hear them laughing at you for choosing to live alone, as if independence was something shameful rather than admirable." Katherine leaned against him as their horses walked side by side. "I remember the day you first arrived at my cabin. You were the first person who didn't question my choice to live alone. You just accepted it as my right." "Because it was your right," Nicholas said simply, "just as it's your right to choose partnership now." As they crested the hill that overlooked Nicholas's property, their property now, Katherine saw the cabin he'd been working on for months. Larger than her own, built with skilled hands. It stood as a testament to his commitment even before he'd formally declared it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," he said softly. "It's beautiful," she whispered, taking in the sturdy structure with its wide porch and new glass windows. "I built it with both of us in mind," Nicholas explained as they dismounted. "There's a room for your books and painting. Space for a proper garden come spring, and land enough that we never need feel crowded." He lifted her from her horse and carried her across the threshold, setting her down gently in the main room. A fire was already burning in the stone fireplace, lit earlier by a neighbor as a wedding gift. The interior was simple, but thoughtfully arranged, a blend of Nicholas's practical nature and details he'd included specifically for her comfort. "Do you remember what you said to me that day in town?" Katherine asked, exploring their new home, when Mrs. Hollister was spreading those awful rumors. Nicholas wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. "I said many things that day. You said my loneliness was over." She turned in his embrace to face him. "At the time, I didn't realize how lonely I truly was. I thought independence meant isolation, that strength required solitude. And now I understand that true independence comes from choosing your companions, not avoiding them." She reached up to touch his face. "I chose solitude because it seemed safer than risking disappointment. You taught me that the right partnership doesn't diminish independence, it enhances it." Nicholas kissed her tenderly. "I spent years drifting, afraid to put down roots because it felt like surrendering freedom. Then I met a stubborn woman defending her turnips from rabbits, and suddenly freedom looked different." That night, as snow fell gently outside their new home, Katherine and Nicholas began their life together not as a conventional frontier couple with prescribed roles and expectations, but as equal partners who had each found in the other the freedom to be fully themselves. Spring came to Wyoming with a rush of green across the prairie. Katherine and Nicholas had weathered the winter comfortably in their cabin, establishing routines that respected both their individual needs and their shared goals. They planted an expanded garden, built a proper barn, and added a small flock of chickens to their growing homestead. Willow Creek gradually adjusted to the unconventional nature of their marriage. Katherine maintained her original property, using the cabin as a workshop where she created intricate embroidery that she sold to a merchant in Cheyenne. Nicholas divided his time between their ranch and occasional work as a guide for new settlers, his knowledge of the territory proving valuable to those just arriving. Together, they hosted community gatherings, offering their home as neutral ground where homesteaders and townspeople could discuss mutual concerns. Katherine started a small lending library with books ordered from back east, while Nicholas taught agricultural techniques he'd learned during his travels. By summer, Katherine realized she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and reflection on how dramatically her life had changed in a single year. "I came west thinking I needed to prove I could survive alone," she told Nicholas, as they sat on their porch watching fireflies dance across the twilight prairie. "I never imagined finding someone who would make independence feel like a shared adventure rather than a solitary battle." Nicholas placed his hand gently on her growing belly. "And I never thought I'd find home in one place after years of wandering. You've given me roots without clipping my wings." Their daughter was born as autumn painted the landscape gold and crimson. They named her Elizabeth, after Katherine's mother, and her arrival completed the transformation of their homestead into a true family haven. On a crisp November day, almost exactly a year after Nicholas had proposed, they bundled Elizabeth warmly and drove their wagon into Willow Creek for the Harvest Festival. The town had grown over the past year, with new businesses and families adding vitality to the community. As they walked through the festival, Katherine noticed Mrs. Hollister approaching with her usual determined stride. She prepared herself for criticism, perhaps of her decision to continue working while raising a child, or her habit of wearing practical trousers around the ranch. Instead, the older woman surprised her. "Mrs. Yates, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice lacking its usual condescension. "I was unkind about your choices when you first arrived. It seems I was. mistaken in my judgment. Katherine shifted Elizabeth in her arms, genuinely startled by this admission. Thank you, Mrs. Hollister. That's very gracious of you to say. Not gracious overdue, the woman corrected. Watching how you and Mr. Yates have built something so special while maintaining your unique ways has been educational for many of us. She lowered her voice. My niece arrives from Philadelphia next month. Headstrong girl, reminds me of you. I'd appreciate if you might speak with her, help her adjust to Western life without making my mistakes in how I treated you. As Mrs. Hollister moved away, Nicholas rejoined Katherine, slipping an arm around her waist. What was that about? She looked almost humble. Katherine laughed softly. I believe Mrs. Hollister just admitted she was wrong. The world truly is full of wonders. Later that evening, as they drove home under a canopy of stars, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had come west seeking independence and had found it not in isolation, but in a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. They laughed at me for living alone, she mused, leaning against Nicholas's shoulder. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. And now they envy what we've built together. What would you say to expanding our little empire? Katherine asked. I've been thinking about that south pasture. It would be perfect for raising horses. Nicholas chuckled, already planning our next adventure. That's why I love you, Katherine Yates. You never stop dreaming bigger. As their cabin came into view, lamplight glowing warmly from the windows, Katherine felt a profound contentment. The loneliness that had once defined her existence was truly over, replaced by a life richer and more fulfilling than she had ever dared imagine, a life of her own choosing, shared with a man who valued her independence as much as she did. The story of the solitary woman and the wandering cowboy who found home in each other became part of Willow Creek's lore, passed down through generations as proof that true strength lies not in isolation, but in the courage to open one's heart to possibility, and that love, in its purest form, doesn't diminish independence, but amplifies it, creating something far greater than either person could achieve alone.